Hey everyone, welcome to Penny's Mind Files Method, the podcast showing you where the off ramp to the healing highway is when you're stuck on the life sucks road that goes nowhere. So far, we've spent most of our time talking about various fear files, and that's important because understanding the hows and whys of those files so that we can move through them and then ultimately resolve them, it is crucial in the healing process. And we will still visit the fear cabinet over the next few months, but it's also important to know what a genuine love file is and how to recognize one and how to create one. So let's talk about what love isn't. I wasted a lot of years trying to find love in all the wrong places. Back then, I didn't even know what genuine love was. I thought love was romance and the comfort that you feel when you're being held by somebody and caressed. But that isn't genuine love. It's body, sensation, pleasure, and it's nurturing. Things that you do in a physical relationship to express the joy that you feel when you are with someone. And these are actions that are supposed to convey love, right? But often it isn't about love of any kind. And when one person in that relationship figures that out, well, then they feel betrayed or used. And both of those things create wounds. Love doesn't wound. Selfishness does, and the quest for pleasure does, because those things vibrate just above fear on the emotional frequency filter scale in craving and longing, which is 8 levels below love. I also thought that genuine love was about finding somebody to spend the rest of my life with. I knew there was no such thing as, the prince and on a white horse, shining armor and all of that, gonna ride in and whisk me away. But I did have hope that I would find somebody who would love me unconditionally and want to marry me and spend the rest of our lives together. But what I was wanting isn't genuine love either. Finding a life partner is more about companionship than unconditional love. Unconditional love is relational, meaning it's a kind of love that hopefully takes place between two people. We've talked about unconditional love before in episode 18 and episode 20. So if you haven't listened or watched those episodes yet, please do, because the more you dive into this program, the more sense it all makes. So unconditional love is dependent on relationships, but genuine love isn't dependent on relationships. It's a state of being, it's a vibrational energy, and that can only resonate from you, from your center, from what Jesus refers to as your chamber. Personal relationships can and often do give you temporary love, but not lasting love, and certainly not self respect and self worth. Which are files that will become dominant in your love cabinet once you clear out and resolve all the ones in your fear cabinet. Remember, the cabinet that holds the most referenced files is your dominant cabinet. And that is the center of your energetic output. If you carry mind files that hold wounds, which means that if your inner vocabulary, the narratives going around in your mind's process, lean more towards blaming other people for whatever is happening or happened in the past in your life, then your fear cabinet is your dominant cabinet. If your files hold feelings of guilt and shame, those are fear files. That's why when we talk about building self-esteem and self-worth, you just can't get that from people, because people are looking for the same things that you are: acceptance and belonging and love. But you do get those things from building a relationship with God, however you choose to understand Him. Jesus tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verse 26, and in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verse 27, that only God can heal the wounds that were inflicted by man. You see, people will offer you praise, and praise can feel like love and acceptance, but it's temporary. Because here's what happens. Eventually, you're going to say or do something that whoever gave you praise in the first place isn't going to agree with. And then you fall out of their praiseworthy circle. You'll disappoint them because ultimately no two people are going to agree 100% of the time. So what happens is that people will self-abandon for the sake of the relationship. I did that a lot in my younger years because I didn't have genuine self-worth or self-respect. I thought that being loved and accepted would give me those things, but my quest to find it only resulted in more wounds and a whole bunch of more mind files that I had to work through and resolve. When you genuinely love yourself, you aren't easily manipulated by anyone because all of the fear files that allowed you to be manipulated in the first place, well, they're resolved, right? Like that's why it's important to go through and identify and review and reassess all the files in your fear cabinet. That's what's meant in the Bible by purification or cleansing. And it's what's meant by the baptism, right? Baptism by water. Water is a metaphor for emotions and feeling. And when you're baptized and you're born again, you're made anew. It's because all the old narratives have been resolved and purified. You see, the messages in the Bible, especially the ones from Jesus, gives us a program to work, which means the Bible basically is the first self-help book ever written, right? The Old Testament tells us history of that particular area of the world. And there are certain books within it that provide specific instructions for how to live life. It's God's program, but not everybody works it. And when church leaders and people preaching to everyone else about how they should live their lives don't work the program themselves, well, we recognize the hypocrisy. But the internal programming in our minds that we've been given that says, hey, you got to listen to these people because they're the authorities, they're the experts, right? That becomes an incongruent message within us because we were like, well, wait, they're not doing that. And so then we hold an internal conflict. Internal conflicts vibrate below courage, which opens us up then to being manipulated. And then when we're manipulated, we eventually become resentful, which keeps us stuck in the lower half of the emotional filter frequency scale. That incongruency, right? We recognize it, we just don't know what to do with it. That's why in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is preaching to a crowd and he points out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, the ruling theological elite at the time. In chapter 23, Jesus is telling everybody that they don't practice what they preach. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you may clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but within you are full of rapine and uncleanness. Thou blind Pharisee, first make clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, that the outside may then become clean." So what he's saying is that the inside, the filters you have that you send and receive information through, need to be clean. And when those are clean, then the outside, everything that you do, what you send out, is also then clean. You see, you can't give away what you don't first possess. That goes as much for love as everything else, right? In A Course in Miracles, the seventh verse in the book says, in chapter 1, says, miracles are everyone's right, but purification is necessary first. And the reason that is because, and here's the kind of the most important thing to understand, is that genuine love files cannot hold emotions that foster uh, any of the things that are in the lower half of the emotional filter frequency scale, because those emotions foster anxiety and anger, create resentments, contribute to grief and depression. Love files talk about genuine self-worth and self-respect. Those hold narratives that vibrate in and above acceptance and the willingness that it took to get to acceptance, right? The willingness to accept the revised truth that you learn about yourself when you review and reassess the narratives in your fear files. And then the new files that you create once you've dealt with the majority of your fear files will vibrate in reason, love, joy, and peace. It took me so many years to realize that genuine self-worth and self-respect can only be found through a dedicated spiritual practice. Now, first, you might not know who or what God is. That's okay. You just have to be willing to find out. And once you start digging in, you'll come to your own understanding of God. And then when you read the spiritual texts, the messages are going to come through better. The messages that are in these texts are the foundation of your love files. When I first started my healing journey, I read a lot of self-help books. That was okay. It gave me some useful information, but it always felt to me like I was missing something really important. This important thing. I didn't know what it was, but what I did know is that, well, I'll recognize it when I see it. And when I first started reading A Course in Miracles, that's when my life really started to change. And then I knew, okay, I found it. What I was looking for, I found it. And it'll be interesting for some people to hear that reading A Course in Miracles led me to reading the Bible and the teachings of Jesus. Eventually, I began reading the Bible from a different perspective, and I realized that all the things in the self-help world all came from the Bible, and all the things in the 12-step recovery world all came from the Bible. See, and you study all of those things when you become a counselor. Everyone, including me, who has traveled the healing highway and got to that junction that says, okay, now you've got this far, you have to go out and share what you've learned. So we all understood that the people who need the Bible the most don't even trust it because they believed the low energy messages that were handed to them, that were coming to them from religious and, I don't know, self-righteous people who didn't bother to clean out their own fear cabinet before telling others how they should live their life. And the message that they often give is that people who've lived some pretty hard lives is that you're not good enough for God, that you'll never measure up because you're impure. Most of the beliefs that I had about God and about Jesus were flat out wrong. They were beliefs that I adopted from other people who I realize now didn't fully understand what Jesus was teaching. They were walking on the surface of the word, focusing on the first layer of the message, but they'd never gone deeper because, well, either they didn't have a wound that needed healing, right? Like they weren't reaching out to it because they were genuinely in pain, or they were just completely oblivious to the core message. So let me give you an example. In the Bible, it says that Jesus was God's only begotten son. Now, that message was taught to me in a way that said nobody else can ever come close to living like Jesus did. But that's not entirely true. Begotten just means unique, and Jesus definitely was unique. There have been other healers. There have been people who were given the power by God to heal disease. There's been other spiritual teachers who understood and taught God's laws over the years. There have been people who were tempted by evil and didn't give in to it. And there have been people who have challenged authority and revealed corruption. So all those folks were similar to Jesus, right? They did all the same things he did. But, and here's the big but, nobody else came back from the dead like he did. Jesus was tortured to death. And then just to make sure that he was dead, a Roman soldier, stuck him with a spear. And yeah, nobody came back from that kind of death. If you haven't watched Jeremiah Johnson talking about what he learned from the shroud and the crucifixion of Jesus, you should really Google that and look that up and watch. He's been on numerous shows. You should watch that because it's definitely informative, because you realize that there's no way anyone could have lived through all of that and come back to life. Now, of course, there have been lots of accounts of people who have died and come back to life, right? We call these near-death experiences. And people talk about them all the time. And they talk about going to heaven and coming back, and they're trying to give us the message. And still, it's dismissed. It's kind of fascinating. Several years ago, neurosurgeon Ibn Alexander, he was brain dead. Basically, the medical establishment considers you dead when you're brain dead. He was in a coma. He went to heaven and he came back. And he wrote a book about it called Proof of Heaven. Just ask your favorite AI to make you a list of all the books of people who claim to have died, gone to heaven, and came back with whatever message. There's lots. But none of those folks were crucified in the way that Jesus was crucified. And pretty much all of them in our time, and anyways, was in a hospital and getting some kind of care. Now, of course, Christians, people who follow the teachings of Jesus, recognize and honor the sacrifice that he made. So let's talk about this idea for a minute, because I know lots of people probably are like I was. I had a big problem with the whole idea of this sacrifice. And my problem was an unresolved mind file that had a lot of emotional filters in it that were vibrating at the bottom of the emotional filter frequency scale. And in this mind file, there was narratives. I had a lot of contempt and anger toward my earthly father for the emotional wounds that he inflicted on me. And because of that, I had a hard time distinguishing my earthly father from God the Father. And I especially had a big problem with the idea that God the Father sent his only begotten son, because I didn't know what begotten even meant, to die for us for our sins. I had a big problem with that because I hadn't sinned. But eventually, with God's grace, I healed that mind file, and I learned that God our Father does not expect anyone to sacrifice anything for him. So, for more on that idea, you should check out my little 3-minute YouTube short entitled Father Confusion. So, again, it's important to understand that when I'm talking about love files, I don't mean files that describe happy experiences, like when you went on vacation and you had so much fun in the sun and it was a vacation to remember, or a birthday party that was so much fun you just wanted it to last forever. Those are low vibrating love files, because once the experience is over, your mind's process goes back to referencing all the dominant fear files. So, no, I'm talking about the love files that are vibrating at or above acceptance. And I'm talking about learning how to create mind files that will become dominant and shift your overall energetic output. So, these are the files that describe your accomplishments. They're stories that talk about taking on a task that seemed like it was, whoa, way beyond you, that you couldn't handle, and took a ton of work and effort. But eventually, you overcame, you completed the task, you did it, and you were proud of yourself, right? These are the kinds of experiences that build confidence, which then goes on to uh, form self respect and self worth. It contributes to your feelings of self respect and self worth. Plus, the kind of files that describe your personal boundaries. When you've worked through the mind files that described how you were wounded by whoever, you're looking at why you allowed people, or you should have been looking at why you allowed people to mistreat you in the first place, because that helps you discover what your insecurities are, and then you can deal with those insecurities and form reasonable boundaries. Love files that shift your energy aren't empty statements. They're backed by and validated by your actions. These are the files that talk about the things that you've done as a result of the things that you learned when you went through and reassessed and reviewed and resolved the files in your fear cabinet, not positive thinking files. We talked about positive thinking in episode 12 and the myth of effortless healing in episode 16. So if you haven't watched those or listened to those episodes, then maybe go back and have a listen, because they'll give you some more insight into what I'm trying to convey here as far as love files go, and in regards to why positive thinking doesn't work and doesn't contribute to the genuine love files that are going to become dominant and vibrate above in the upper half of the emotional filter frequency scale. So that's it for today. I hope you heard something here that is going to help you help yourself, something that gave you a little aha. Let me know what you think in the comments, and help others find their way to this podcast just by even hitting a thumbs up, because it tells the algorithms to share it with other like-minded people who are looking to find their way to the healing highway. See you next time.